and this is the Bearded Music Teacher podcast, also known as Mr. E, or Mr. E, also known as the Bearded Music Teacher podcast. And today is episode 10. Now, right now it's being a little slow, so we're going to have to wait just a minute. So, before we get too far down into this, just want to remind everyone who's listening or who's watching this video that this is a podcast for educational purposes for my students in my classroom. Others that are outside my classroom are certainly welcome to explore these episodes, share these episodes, and just enjoy it all together. Uh, Today we're going to be talking about episode 10, which is Elvis. As I was planning this out, I couldn't think of a better person to have a landmark episode of episode 10 than Elvis. So I timed this pretty well. So let's get right down to it. Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, then moved to Memphis at age 13. He grew up in a thriving African American music scene, and his parents were fans of country and western. So he had this blend of different styles. He grew up listening to country and western. He was very much a fan of country and western music, and um, he later on really explored that idea um, of R&B. In fact, he would he from the gospel he heard in church, the country music he heard on the radio, and the blues and R&B he heard on Beale Street in Memphis, really kind of brought everything together. And it wasn't the fact, and Sam Phillips said this in his biography that was written about him. I believe it was after his passing. It's not that long ago that we had Sam Phillips pass away. But he said that it wasn't that Elvis was a talented musician. By all means, he really wasn't, and I'll go into that here in a second. But it was his creative drive that drove him to it. All right. So it was that creative drive that really brought Elvis out into the forefront. Now, I talked about Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips, which we're going to talk about later, was a guy from Sun Records. He was the guy for Sun Records. And in 1954, Phillips had long sought to bring the sound of R&B, specifically African American R&B, to the quote white audience. And so what he wanted to do is Sam Phillips really wanted to break down what a lot of people called back then as the color barrier or the color line. Uh, Mind you, this is the pre-civil rights movement in the United States. So we still had drinking fountains, the bathrooms, restaurants, movie theaters. Probably I wasn't born back then, but you can look up a lot of historical things that say colored only, or black only, or white only. So that's what that's what we're talking about. There's that clear divide in the United States pre-civil rights movement of the 1960s that create this. So he came in. Phillips had this service where you could just record custom records. So Elvis came in and recorded a pair of songs, and it kind of wasn't. I mean, he paid $2 to record a pair of songs. That was it. $2. Now back then, that was a fair amount of money. To us in the year 2021, not that much. $2 is nothing. So when Sam Phillips ended up falling on these records, like he discovered them, he was like, whoa, that is something right there. And so he put him on the label, and Elvis's first single for the label was backed by a guitarist named Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, and they combined the blues song "That's All Right," and that country bluegrass song of "Blue Moon of Kentucky" as that single, and it was done in a quicker tempo. That's how we get that drive, and you see that a lot of times The Rolling Stones did it with a Buddy Holly song that we'll talk about when we get to the Rolling Stones. So when the single was released in 54, everyone assumed that Elvis Presley was African American. They thought by his voice that he was African American, and everyone's like, what? But that really shook up everything. And his first performance was in October 16th, 54. Um, and he initially he initially licensed the recording to an LA label called Modern and Chicago's Chess Records. But then things just turned differently and things like that. So later on in 1955, Sun Records kind of fell on a little bit of hard times. They needed funds to work as a record label. So Elvis's manager believed he could never achieve national success with Sun Records. He was like, this isn't going to work. And RCA paid Sam Phillips for an absolute unheard of amount of $35,000 for the contract. Now, back then, 35,000 was a huge sum of money. Absolutely huge. At this point in the music industry, no one has ever heard of that. And that became known as the RCA Elvis Deal. And why was this huge? Well, now we have a open market for contracts with artists, with record labels. It used to be where they were under contract, they did all this, they did their terms of their contract, the artist did, and then they moved whether they liked it or not. But it just depended. If they liked it, they stayed with that label. If they didn't, they moved on. So now we have this unheard of amount that really sets the benchmark for rock artists. Keep in mind, Elvis was known as kind of like a rockabilly kind of artist, like Jerry Lee Lewis. But 35,000 wasn't worth it. Like it really wasn't. Elvis was like the original, one of the original guys of rockabilly, really. And so Phillips used that money actually to fund Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Roy Orbison. Now, Jerry Lee Lewis and Roy Orbison went on to be a lot of rockabilly sound. We discussed that last episode with Jerry Lee Lewis. So Presley's first single on RCA was Heartbreak Hotel. And that was huge. It hit number one on the pop and the country and western charts in early 56 and rose as high as 5 on the R&B charts. So he goes from a relatively regional flavor with um, Sun Records in 55 to a huge hit by early 1956. And then he was on the Toast of the Town, which is an Ed Sullivan show. Now, Presley's move to RCA was groundbreaking because the major labels weren't interested in rock and roll. We have to realize is that rock was a fad. Elvis shouldn't have happened, really. If you look at the basic trends in the market at that time, everyone was like, okay, yeah, this little rock stuff, it'll happen. It'll kind of blip, and then that'll be it. But this changed the game. That's why I mentioned that it was an unheard of amount of money, and that's why we had all these contracts now going for a lot more in rock music, because it didn't happen. It just didn't happen, and that's what really set the stage for it. So RCA actually helped Sun Records out by buying out Elvis's contract, because they provided such a huge sum of money. Elvis went on to huge success, and then Sun Records still thrived for quite a while. Now, That's All Right Mama was the first cover. All right, it was called That's All Right. A lot of people know as That's All Right Mama. I would highly recommend that you look at that song. It's been covered by a lot. And I can't remember exactly, and I don't have it in my notes here, of what was the actual artist. I should say, who was the actual artist of That's All Right Mama. I'd have to jump back into my research and find it. But he did cover That's All Right Mama, Blue Moon of Kentucky, I Love You Because, I don't care if the sun don't shine. And he took kind of the same path as Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and others by doing covers and making his career happen from that. He took that Elvis style of recording or sound and made it to what we know as rockabilly, as I've said before. And rockabilly, I keep on throwing the term rockabilly out there. Let's quick define it. Traditionally, it's recorded without drums and with acoustic guitar and upright bass. And so later with Jerry Lee Lewis takes that into his piano work. So by pounding on the piano. Now, Elvis had a huge run in mid 50s, but things kind of hit a bit of a rocky start. He was called up to go into the Army between 1958 and 1960, and was actually stationed in Germany. But how they got around it was this. Before Elvis went off into the Army, they recorded a bunch of material. And Elvis at the time was known as this teenage heartthrob that would do he got the nickname Elvis the Pelvis because he would move his hips and his legs in that iconic Elvis move. And I show this in class. Not me, I show videos of Elvis doing that. And we discuss how that was huge to the culture of the time, because at that time you just didn't do that. You just did not do that. It was seen as vulgar. It was seen as inappropriate in some cases. And so a lot of people protested that. A lot of people did a lot of I wouldn't say evil things, but very rude things, because they thought that Elvis was responsible for breaking down the moral structure of the family. Okay. So when he went in, though, that nickname of Elvis the Pelvis then went to Elvis the GI. All right. He now became in the Army. He had a ton of material already recorded. And Elvis was really worried that when he would go into the Army, he was riding such a career high of selling thousands and millions of records. He was huge, to not making it. He felt like he would go into the military after being called upon to do his duty in the military, and his career would end. He would come back with nothing. But what happened was the company that he worked for, okay, so the guys under RCA would slowly release hits throughout this stint, and keep his name kind of in the mainstream pop culture. And so the hits, to kind of go through all this real quick, the things that I want you to really closely to look at, the hits, besides, of course, That's All Right Mama, but Stuck on You, which hit the pop charts at 1, peaked at the R&B charts at the number 6 spot. Country, it went to number 27. That was in 1960. Hound Dog, which everyone seems like they know Hound Dog. That was number 1 on the pops chart, number 6 in the R&B chart, 10 in the country chart. So that was a pretty high charting song. And that was done in 1956. So that was at the height of the beginning of the rock music fad. Too Much, that's a deeper cut. Although it's funny because everyone doesn't really place that in like the huge, like the huge hits for Elvis. That was actually his better hit. 1 in the pop charts, 3 in the R&B charts, 3 in the country charts, and that was in 57. So a lot of people, if you want to, they overlook Too Much, but it charted better than Hound Dog. And then Teddy Bear, that was number 1 across the entire charts, both pop, R&B, and country, and that was in 1957. It's Now or Never, which was number 1 on the pop charts, number 7 in the R&B charts, and that was in 1960. You also have things like Jailhouse Rock and just a myriad of other songs. The catalog for Elvis is quite huge, both in live recordings and in studio recordings. He did an absolute job covering the songs. Now, separating Elvis from his close association with rock and roll image was critical and a prudent business move. He changed because by the late 1950s, the first wave of rock was fading. So to stay relevant in the pop culture, he had to change as well. And as a result, he established himself as in the pop culture as a grown-up, mature rocker by the mid 1960s when he got out of the army. So there's these two kind of versions, I guess you could say, of Elvis: the pre-army Elvis and then the post-army Elvis. Pre-army Elvis was the teenage heartthrob, the dancing, grooving, party, rock and roll image kind of guy. And then when he came out of the military, he realized that that wasn't going to work anymore to stay relevant in the business. And so what he did is he really grew up and he took a lot of movie roles. He took a lot of things that kept him in the pop culture as a serious artist, not a not so people the later or older generations didn't take him as serious. So he developed and grew with the times. Now, ultimately, Elvis did pass away. The people say, well, he died on the toilet. um, and he did continue to record throughout the 70s. He did decline; his health did decline, um, and he increasingly looked in sad shape in the 70s. And then finally, in August 1977, in Memphis, at his mansion called Graceland, he died of a cardiac arrhythmia episode, which is that was listed as his cause of death. And you can still go to Graceland, to which is his was his home. It acts as a museum of sorts to Elvis. And things that you need to be aware of is that he amounted or acquired 104 top 40 hits, and that's an international record. All right, so that's why he kind of sits at the top of at the mountain, kind of as the king on the throne of rock and roll, is because he's had huge hits and he did such an amazing job with that. Now, if you want to look at films, I already mentioned like All Shook Up, Jailhouse Rock, Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, the others, Teddy Bear. But if you want to look at movies, and this is um, after the spot in the army, check out Blue Hawaii, Girl Happy, and Viva Las Vegas. Those are some that would be good to look at. All right, so that wraps it up for Elvis. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at MR_E_music FCS. That's my professional Twitter account where I try to keep up with everything. Also, again, share this podcast with as many people as you can, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.